course, you cannot expect the truth from imperialism. What would you have it say? The imperialist ruling class can hardly be expected to admit that modern war is a product of and inseparable from imperialism. That tens of millions of people were slaughtered during the war in order to decide which group of imperialist bandits, Anglo, French, or German, Italian, Japanese, was to have the greatest share in plundering the world. That the elimination of war is possible only through complete elimination of the division of society into classes. That it's impossible, in Lenin's words, to escape imperialist war and the imperialist world, which inevitably engenders imperialist war. It's impossible to escape that inferno except by Bolshevik struggle and a Bolshevik revolution. And what's more, really, it's important to remember that all the major democratic in quotation marks, imperialist powers were complicit in the rise of Nazi Germany. They were complicit in it because the main purpose was to actually get somehow Germany to fight a war on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union. So the Germans, Nazis, were helped to power by America, Britain, and France. German forces were allowed to enter the Ruhr. Germany was allowed to build its air force. Germany was supplied with trucks, oil, and spare parts for its air force by the American corporation. Germany was allowed to annex Austria. Germany was allowed to take over Czechoslovakia. All this was done. And during the war, during the war, one of the German industrialists was being tried for war crimes. What was his crime? That he, as an industrialist, had helped to arm and supply material to the German Nazis to help them wage the war. He said, before you prosecute me, prosecute your own capitalists, because they were doing exactly the same. There was, of course, no answer. It was a victor's trial, and of course, it didn't bring him much joy, particularly because he spoke the truth. Bourgeoisie says every day that Hitler's fate was settled in the Atlantic. That Hitler was defeated by his own madness. You know, Hitler was a product of madness. Hitler was defeated by his own madness. Soviet Union did not win because it had brilliant generals and a brilliant army and a brilliant socialist system and led by a brilliant communist party and a brilliant leader like Joseph Stalin. No, it won because of general winters. Have you heard of winters?
No.
Russian winters are very cold. The cold does not affect the Russians. Cold only affects the Germans, the British, the Americans, but the Russians absolutely love cold. The more cold it is, the better it is. And they go on their belly to the battlefield of Stalingrad and they win because they stand the cold. Now this is not history, comrades. This is not history, it's a mockery of history. It's not being historical, it's being hysterical to put forward. No, comrades, we have a duty to say, it was not General Winters who won the war. It was the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the USSR, the peoples of the USSR, and their government, and their leadership, and their commander-in-chief, Joseph Stalin. And Hitler's fate was not sealed in the Atlantic, or in North Africa, or in Italy, or in Belgium. This fate was sealed in the titanic battles of Moscow, Leningrad, Stalingrad, Kursk, and Berlin. When the bourgeoisie's own regime was in danger, they could afford to speak the truth. Let me give you 2-3 quotations. Anti-communist though was, although he continued his plots against the Soviet Union not before the war, but also during the war and after the war. This is what Churchill had to say. It's the Russian army that tore the guts out of the German military machine. You hear me? Churchill, Sir Winston Churchill. And General Charles de Gaulle, who was slightly less devious than Churchill and slightly more honest than Churchill. And he frankly says, the Russian efforts inflicting irreparable damage to the German war machine were the main factor in the liberation of our country's territory. Namely, France would not have been liberated had it not been for the Red Army. Yeah. And it's not for nothing that even today you can go to Paris and you can find a metro station called Stalingrad. It's not for nothing that you can go to the center of Brussels and you can find a street called Boulevard Stalingrad. Franklin Roosevelt, no less, president of the most powerful imperialist country. This is what he says: Russian armies are killing more Germans and destroying Axis material than all the 25 nations put together. And further, in his letter of February 1943, President Roosevelt wrote to Stalin as follows. I'd like you to pay attention to this quotation because it's from Roosevelt. If I say the same thing, people say you're making it up. But Roosevelt couldn't have been making it up because he obviously was the apostle of truth. And in this case, he really was. On behalf of the people of the United States, I want to express to the Red Army on its 25th anniversary our profound admiration for its magnificent achievements, unsurpassed in all human history. Now, normally the Americans say no country's army has ever had greater feats and greater performance than their army. But he's now saying that the feats of the Soviet army are unsurpassed in world history. For many months, in spite of many tremendous losses of supplies, transportation and territory, the Red Army denied victory to the most powerful enemy. It checked him at Stalingrad, at Moscow, at Voronezh, in the Caucasus, and finally at the immortal Battle of Stalingrad, the Red Army not only defeated the enemy, but launched the great offensive, which is still moving forward along the whole front from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The Red Army and the Russian people have surely started the Hitler forces on the road to ultimate defeat. And his Secretary of State, Stettinius, says, the American people should remember that they were on the brink of disaster in 1942. If the Soviet Union had failed to hold on its front, Germany would have been in a position to conquer Great Britain. They would have been able to overrun Africa too, and in this event, they would have established a foothold in Latin America. Comrades, apart from these statesmen of the most important imperialist powers, the United States, Britain and France, the fact of the matter is that all objective observers agree that Western imperialism went to war against Nazi Germany, not in the interest of freedom and not in the fight against fascism, but to protect its own colonies and imperialist interests after all attempts at safeguarding the same had failed through the policy of appeasement and resulted in ignominious and scandalous collapse.